Producing enough penicillin for a single patient required 2,000 liters of mold culture. That is enough liquid to fill 10 bathtubs for one person. You think you know the story of penicillin, the miracle drug that conquered infection and changed medicine forever. The official history credits 3 men, Alexander Fleming, Ernst Chain, and Howard Florey, all of them British. They rightly received the Nobel Prize in 1945 for their work. But the history books you read in school leave out the most important chapter. And here is where the story takes a sharp turn. In the summer of 1941, with London burning under the Blitz, 2 of those scientists, Florey and his colleague Norman Heatley, boarded a plane for the United States. They traveled in secret. They carried no state papers, no military plans. They carried something far more valuable, a small suitcase containing the living mold penicillium. Their problem was agonizingly simple. They had discovered a miracle, but they could not produce it. Back in Oxford, their entire operation was a collection of bedpans and milk bottles, growing a thin layer of mold on the surface. It was brilliant science. It was also hopelessly inefficient. Think about that for a moment. You hold the key to saving millions of lives, but you can't make enough for even one small town. The official record calls their trip a scientific collaboration, but records from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, unsealed decades later, paint a picture of quiet desperation. Their destination was not a famous university. It was Peoria, Illinois, a small government lab in the middle of corn country. There, an American scientist named Andrew Jackson Moyer listened to their problem. He looked at their elegant, small-scale methods, and he proposed something the British team found almost vulgar. He wanted to forget the lab bottles and use massive, 10,000-gallon industrial vats, the kind used to make soft drinks. He suggested deep tank fermentation, a brute-force American industrial process. It was a gamble. No one knew if the delicate mold could even survive it. Yet by 1944, American factories, using Moyer's process and a new super strain of mold found on a rotting cantaloupe in a Peoria market, were producing more penicillin every month than the British had produced in the entire war. Enough was made to treat every single Allied soldier wounded on D-Day. The discovery was British. The miracle of mass production was entirely American. The Nobel Prize was awarded in 1945. Fleming, Florey, and Chain became legends. Andrew Jackson Moyer was not mentioned. This was not an oversight. It was a condition of the alliance. So if the credit for the world's most important medicine was the price of entry, what else was America forced to give away? Penicillin was American anonymity. This was not an isolated incident. Think about that. You deliver a miracle, and the world believes someone else did it. What other innovations, born from American ingenuity, suffered the same fate? The official narratives often omit the extraordinary efforts made on this side of the Atlantic. They stop short, conveniently. In 1940, the British military faced a dire problem. Their radar, a revolutionary technology, was too bulky for their fighter planes. The magnetron, the heart of the system, weighed over 500 pounds. Imagine trying to maneuver a nimble Spitfire with that kind of dead weight. British scientists, including John Randall and Harry Boot, had invented a cavity magnetron at the University of Birmingham in 1940. It was a breakthrough. It produced powerful microwaves, essential for radar, but it was still too large. It was a laboratory curiosity, not a weapon. And here's where it gets interesting. In September 1940, a British delegation, led by Sir Henry Tizard, arrived in Washington, D.C. They brought with them a small, unassuming black box. Inside that box was a prototype of the cavity magnetron. It was still large, but promising. The British, desperate, offered to share their most advanced technologies with the Americans. This became known as the Tizard mission, What they received in return was not just American industrial might, but a fundamental shift in the magnetron's design. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the newly formed Radiation Laboratory, or RAD Lab, took up the challenge. They put their brightest minds on it. One of those minds belonged to Percy Spencer. Spencer, a self-taught engineer at Raytheon, had no formal education past grammar school. Yet he possessed an uncanny intuition for electronics. He looked at the British magnetron. He saw its potential, but also its limitations. He began to experiment with different forms of copper, different cavity shapes. He worked relentlessly. His team redesigned the British magnetron. They made it smaller, more powerful, more efficient. By 1941, Spencer's team had developed a magnetron weighing just a few pounds. This was a true marvel. This compact device could fit into the nose of a fighter plane. It could guide bombers through the darkest night. It allowed Allied aircraft to detect U-boats lurking beneath the waves. This American innovation directly led to the radar systems that turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. It saved countless ships. It saved countless lives. Yet how many people recognized the name Percy Spencer? His work was crucial. His name is largely absent from the official histories. You might think this was simply wartime secrecy, but the silence continued for decades. The British narrative often focuses on their initial invention. They rarely mention the radical American improvements that made it militarily viable. This pattern repeats. Consider the Norden bomb sight. This device, developed by Carl Norden, a Dutch engineer working in America, was a marvel of precision engineering. It allowed bombers to drop their payloads with unprecedented accuracy from altitudes of 20,000 feet. The U.S. Army Air Forces considered it so vital, so secret, that bombardiers swore an oath to protect it with their lives. They called it the Blue Ox. Its complex mechanisms, involving gyroscopes and optics, were a testament to American manufacturing capability. During the war, tens of thousands of these bomb sights were produced in American factories. They were instrumental in the strategic bombing campaigns over Germany and Japan. Yet after the war, its significance was often downplayed. Its American origins sometimes blurred. The official accounts focused on the air crews, not the technology that empowered them. Was this simply a matter of national pride, or something more calculated? The scale of American production, the sheer volume of material and innovation, often gets overshadowed. The United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft during the war, more than any other nation. Over 80,000 tanks, millions of rifles. This was the true arsenal of democracy. But the narrative, you see, often shifts. It highlights the battles, the heroes, the resistance. It often omits the industrial might that made victory possible, the sheer, relentless output of American factories. We built the landing craft for D-Day. We built the Liberty ships that traversed the Atlantic. We built the infrastructure of victory. And this, my friend, is a story that needs telling. What happens when the world forgets who built the weapons of freedom? The weapons of freedom. You might think the debt owed to American industrial might would be clear. But consider this. The French, after the war, were quick to claim their place among the victors. A critical role, they argued. A valid contribution. And here's where it gets interesting. Post-war narratives, especially in Europe, often emphasized the resistance movements. They highlighted the bravery of underground fighters. These stories are undeniably true, but they sometimes overshadow the immense material support that made liberation possible. During the war, the United States provided over $50 billion in aid through the Lend-Lease Act. This was not a small sum. This was an economic earthquake. It was an unprecedented transfer of resources to allied nations. Great Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and France all received massive quantities of tanks, planes, ships, and food. Think about what that means. You're fighting a war, and someone else is supplying the very tools you need to survive. The official French history, however, often downplays this. It focuses on their own internal struggles. It highlights their resilience. A certain narrative of self-reliance emerged. This narrative, while powerful, sometimes obscured the true scale of the American contribution. De Gaulle's Free French forces, for instance, were equipped almost entirely with American and British gear. Their uniforms, their vehicles, their weapons, all supplied. By 1944, the French First Army, fighting alongside American forces, relied heavily on American logistics. Over 200,000 men, all needing food, fuel, and ammunition, every single day. This was a logistical marvel. Yet how often do you hear about the American supply lines in French war documentaries? The focus shifts. It becomes about their fighting spirit, their courage, which was undeniable. But courage alone does not win modern wars. The French, after D-Day, needed everything. Their infrastructure was shattered. Their industries were decimated. They were a nation on its knees. We provided the means for them to stand again. We gave them the tools to fight. And we gave them the means to rebuild. The Marshall Plan, implemented after the war, injected billions more into the European economies. France received a substantial portion, over $2.7 billion. This aid was instrumental in their post-war recovery. It rebuilt their factories. It revitalized their agriculture. This was not charity. This was a strategic investment in peace. You might ask, why would a nation downplay such vital assistance? The answer, perhaps, lies in national pride, in the desire to control one's own story, to present a narrative of strength and independence, even if it means selectively remembering certain facts. Consider the M4 Sherman tank. Over 50,000 of these tanks were produced by the United States during the war. They were the backbone of the Allied armored forces. French armored divisions, operating under General Leclerc, were equipped with these American tanks. They rolled into Paris in August 1944, a symbol of liberation. But whose symbol? The tanks were American. The crews were French. The victory was shared. Yet the images often highlight the French tricolor flag, not the American manufacturing label. The official accounts, you see, can be carefully curated. They can emphasize certain elements while omitting others. This is not to diminish French heroism. Not at all. Their resistance was real. Their sacrifices were immense. But the scale of American involvement, the sheer volume of resources poured into the European theater, is often understated. It's almost as if acknowledging the full extent of American support would somehow lessen their own achievement. The French claim to a significant role in the Allied victory is undeniable. But the foundation of that role, the very equipment they used, the food they ate, the fuel for their vehicles, much of it came from across the Atlantic. This was the silent engine of their liberation, an engine built in American factories. It powered their fight. It rebuilt their nation. And yet, this particular connection, it's rarely highlighted. What happens when history itself becomes a battlefield for national narratives? Becomes a battlefield for national narratives. When the stories we tell ourselves overshadow the sacrifices made by others. This is where the numbers cease to be abstract. They become faces. They become lives. You might focus on the grand strategies, the sweeping movements of armies. But look closer. Look at the individual soldier. Look at Private First Class James T. Harris from a small farm in Iowa, who landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. He carried an M1 Garand rifle made in Springfield, Massachusetts. His boots were American. His helmet, American. His life, a statistic in the massive American-led invasion. Nearly 160,000 Allied troops landed on D-Day. Over 73,000 of them were American. Think about that sheer number. More than 9,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded that day. A staggering cost. The official narratives often celebrate the combined Allied effort, and rightly so. But the scale of American involvement, the human wave that broke against Hitler's Atlantic Wall, is often understated. The British and Canadian forces also fought with incredible bravery. Yet the American sector, Omaha and Utah beaches, saw some of the most brutal fighting. The casualties there were immense. They suffered unimaginable losses. And here's where it gets personal. Imagine Private Harris, huddled behind a seawall, the air thick with machine gun fire. He saw his friends fall. He felt the sand beneath his hands, stained with blood. His story, and the stories of thousands like him, powered the liberation of Europe. The French resistance fighters, celebrated in their own histories, were invaluable. They provided intelligence. They sabotaged German supply lines. But they did not storm the beaches of Normandy. They did not face the concentrated fire of German pillboxes. That was largely an American burden. A burden carried by young men from towns you've never heard of. Men who had never seen Europe before. Men like Sergeant Michael O'Malley from Philadelphia, a tank commander in the 743rd Tank Battalion. His M4 Sherman, an American-made machine, rolled off a landing craft and into the chaos. He saw the craters, the shattered bodies. He heard the screams. His tank, a steel behemoth, provided cover for infantrymen. It opened the way. This was the reality on the ground. The French narrative often focuses on the heroism of General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, which liberated Paris, and their courage was undeniable. But Leclerc's division was equipped with American tanks, American trucks, American rifles. Their fuel, their ammunition, their food, all American. The very tools of their liberation were supplied from across the Atlantic. This was not a small detail. It was the foundation of their ability to fight. And yet, this particular connection, it's rarely highlighted. You might read books about the French resistance. You might watch films about their bravery. But how often do you hear about the 11 million tons of supplies that crossed the Atlantic in American Liberty ships? The logistical miracle that sustained the entire European campaign. This was the silent engine of victory, an engine built by American workers, fueled by American resources. It powered their fight. It rebuilt their nation. The individual stories of American heroism and sacrifice, the sheer weight of their presence, often get lost in the broader narrative of Allied cooperation. What happens when the world forgets who paid the ultimate price in blood and treasure to secure freedom for others? When the narratives of convenience obscure the true cost of liberation, the quiet ache of a nation that gave so much only to see its contributions minimized. This is not just history. This is personal. Ache. It isn't born from bitterness. It comes from a need for truth. Because this isn't just about the past. It's about the foundation of the world we live in right now. And here we come to the most profound silence of all, the Soviet Union. The official Soviet history of the Great Patriotic War was one of singular, heroic sacrifice. A story of Russian steel and Russian will, alone against the fascist machine. But secret documents, released only after the fall of the Berlin Wall, tell a different story. The United States sent over $11.3 billion in Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets. That's more than $180 billion in today's money. Think about that. You are told a story for 50 years, and it's missing a key character. Over 400,000 jeeps and trucks flowed into the USSR from American factories. They received 14,000 aircraft and nearly 13,000 tanks. The Red Army advanced on Berlin riding in American Studebaker trucks, communicating with American radios, their soldiers sometimes fed with American canned meat. Nikita Khrushchev himself admitted it in his private memoirs. "I would like to express my candid opinion," he wrote. "Without American production, we would not have been able to win the war." This was never said publicly. Why? Why erase the hand that helped you? This pattern of selective memory is not about simple pride. It's about control. The control of a nation's own story. After the war, America didn't just send weapons, it sent hope. The Marshall Plan poured $13 billion into re-shattered Europe. It wasn't a loan. It was a gift, designed to create stable democracies and prevent the slide back into chaos. It was an investment in peace, an idea born in Washington, and yet, over time, even this narrative has been questioned. Was it selfless generosity, or a clever play for economic dominance? The truth, as always, is complicated, but the intention was clear: to build a partnership. History is not a zero-sum game. To acknowledge the American factory worker in Detroit does not diminish the courage of a Russian soldier at Stalingrad. To remember the American scientist in Peoria does not cheapen the discovery made in Oxford. It completes the picture. It tells the whole truth. And shared victory is meaningless without a shared truth. The alliances forged in the fire of that war still shape our world. They are the bedrock of our global security. But memory is fragile, and national stories are powerful things. So the final question isn't about who deserves more credit. It's not about demanding a thank you. The real question is this: what happens to an alliance when its shared history is no longer shared? What becomes of the bridge when one side forgets who helped lay the stones?